And final speaker, Jorge Chavez. Jorge is Associate Professor and Faculty Fellow at Bowling Green State University Center for Family and Demographic Research. His research focuses on life course perspectives, on child maltreatment and adult outcomes, race ethnic differences in the comorbidity of mental health problems, and violent behavior and understanding change and development in violence within community and neighborhood contexts. Presently, he is investigating spatiotemporal trends in lethal violence across neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. This work has pioneered the application of a semi-parametric group-based trajectory methodology and exploratory spatial data analysis to examine community-level violence trajectories and their spatial organization. In addition, his most recent project examines offender attributions regarding deviant behavior, individual processes of social learning, and community neighborhood factors that may contribute to intimate partner violence. Let's welcome Jorge Chavez.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. It's always great to be back in New York City and at John Jay. And I get the benefit of having heard our three earlier speakers, and they did a really nice job of kind of setting everything up that I'll be talking about, and give me a nice chance to kind of really kind of contrast the research that I'm doing with kind of what they've shown so far today, because I'm coming from a little bit of an outside perspective, and I'm going to focus really on what the experience is for immigrant communities in very small rural areas where there's not a very large immigrant population, focusing really on the effects of local and state level enforcement. So what is it really like down at that level where laws get implemented, and look at the impact intersection of federal policy, local communities, and what kind of what the trickle down effect is of deportation policies on behavior. And I'll be able to kind of jump over some of my earlier slides. I don't have to set this up as a social problem because our speakers have already spoken about that. What I find interesting is that in Michelle's talk about federalism here says that it's almost an outsourcing of immigration policy to the states and local authorities. But really it's almost even beyond that to some degree. There's some cooperation, there's some shared authority, but states to a large degree have overtaken that, whereas the cart pulling the horse rather than the other way around. And I have this graph here to show kind of part of that trend. If you look at state level initiatives, so not looking at county, not looking at federal laws, looking at legislation at the state level, we've seen over 9,000 state level resolutions or pieces of legislation that have been proposed at the state level. Of these, over 1,000 have been actually enacted into law, with every state in the nation kind of participating in creating their own little immigration policy. And these policies have tremendous potential for impact here. And you see that this trend really begins around 2005. So that this is kind of part of the states kind of rising to this rhetoric about our immigration system is broken. We've got a problem with immigration. Immigration is criminogenic. Immigration, takes away from our economy. So it's kind of a local response to that rhetoric, in addition, above and beyond that federal response, because the federal system is being perceived as being broken and unable to do the job. And these laws have targeted all kinds of different types of initiatives and issues, focusing on things like driver's license, as was mentioned earlier, but also other things like access to health and welfare services, access to education, ability to get employment. So really targeting all different kinds of domains. And the interesting issue here is that, as Juan mentioned, that some of these policies can be pro-immigrant, providing services, providing access, or restrictive and anti-immigrant, really limiting access to not just unauthorized immigrants, but also immigrants who have legal status and authorized status in the country. So it's really a huge mix of policy at the local level, and it's important for us to kind of understand kind of what that means for communities. And for me, what's interesting is that if you look at the immigration patterns of today compared to what they've been historically, is that we're seeing the largest growth in those areas that have not historically had large immigrant populations. So while New York City has a very large immigrant population, and as Shirley mentioned, it's got a long history of it. If you look at where immigration is occurring today, it's really in rural, small communities. The places that are experiencing the largest growth are those ones that have never had immigrants before, and that don't really have the infrastructure in place in order to welcome these populations in, and that are responding in sometimes not so welcoming manners. So it's interesting for us to understand this process. In prior work that I've done with Marie Provine, we looked at, well, what type of places create policies targeting immigrant? What type of places create restrictive policies? What type of places create more welcoming policies? And we controlled for things like, well, are there higher crime rates? Is the economy doing badly? Is there a drain on resources? And none of that stuff seems to matter when it comes to restrictionist policies. Restrictionist policies are responding to conservative ideology, the belief and perception that immigrant populations are bad, criminogenic, or problems, regardless of what the reality actually shows. In terms of pro-immigrant policies, what you see is that you need to have a critical mass of Latino populations or immigrant populations in order to kind of drive policy. So despite the rhetoric, what drives the restrictions policy is the belief that immigrants are bad. And so policy has been shown in earlier research that it can have multiple domains of impact, and most of this work has focused on federal level policy targeting immigrants. And very little research has looked at state level policy. And state level policy, I'm going to argue, is a little bit different, because federal policy, we know that we've got special kind of departments and offices and organizations that are meant to target immigration enforcement. At the local level, this is being done by police. This is police in a democratic society that is really meant to protect and serve. It has a very different role rather than targeting immigration policy. And there could be some serious consequences in these communities when police are starting to usurp this role of immigration enforcement, which I'll talk a little bit about today. The interesting part of this study is that really when it started was really looking at the kind of educational pipeline. What is going on with immigrant children as they're going from elementary school to middle school, high school, and then college, and where they fall into the gaps. And as we were doing this research, the issue of recent legislative changes kind of kept coming up again and again, and so we kind of delved more into that. As part of an ethnographic study, the primary researcher for this study spent 2 years living in the community, and it's based on semi-structured interviews that looked specifically at how immigrants' lives were impacted by recent legislative changes. And we're able to look at families that have both authorized immigrants and unauthorized immigrants. And in the chapter that's in the edited volume, what we saw is that the issue of mixed status families is very important, because while immigration as a status is an individual sort of characteristic or measure, in terms of real life, it's a whole family that is being impacted by the status. People, whether it's siblings or parents or children or loved ones, these mixed statuses within families are problematic for multiple people, not just that one individual. And we talked to 40 families in a small rural Midwestern county in Indiana. And so we'll talk about their experiences. Indiana, where we're doing the study, is kind of representative of much of other parts of the country where the Latino population and immigrant population is growing, but they haven't historically been there before. And they're facing the economic problems the same way that we're seeing in the rest of the country. And it's interesting because if you look at where the growth is happening the most now, it really is in those areas outside New York, outside Los Angeles, outside Chicago, in these kind of smaller rural areas. In terms of immigration policy at the local level, Indiana is very much modeled on Arizona and their SB 1070. What we see is that they participate in all counties in Indiana in secure communities, which was mentioned earlier. And they've implemented an omnibus policy that pretty much matched in detail by detail the Arizona policy. Yet you don't really hear about these Midwestern states enacting these same sorts of laws. And they place numerous restrictions, not just in terms of getting access to licenses, although that was one of those things, but in terms of access to education, in terms of access to health care and health services, in terms of being able to find employment. And they're also creating harsher penalties for immigration violations, so that not only do you have federal consequences, but you've got state and local consequences as well that are being enforced by the police, which is something of a different animal. And so in the earlier chapter, we focus on how this impacts family, what it means for sense of security, for sense of isolation, for child well-being, and at this point, we've kind of taken a different focus. Well, what does it mean for how the community interacts with the police? What does it mean for potential impact on crime? And so what we're seeing is that this is really having an impact on kind of the community's perceptions of the police in general in terms of creating more legal cynicism and mistrust of the police. And the ironic part is that recent research suggests that immigrant communities in general as a whole are more likely to trust the police initially. They're more likely to have a more positive view of the police. Recent research by Kirk and Papachristos that was done in New York City suggests that immigrant communities compared to non-immigrant communities are more likely to have more favorable views of police. And these immigration policies are having an impact where they're likely to change that. And so this first quote refers to that specifically. With the new law, and I know this is small, so I don't know if you can see it in the back, so I'll read this one quickly. It's difficult to have trust in the police. It's very difficult to tell you the truth. Before you get here, everyone tells you about the police here, that they are very straight or strict. The police are, you can't say this, you can't do anything. And as time passed, we noticed that many police are like the same in Mexico. They're corrupt, that they have their preferences, that sometimes they treat the people bad. And this was referring specifically to how these new policies are changing. That rather than police being something they can trust, that they can no longer have that trust in place. And this has real consequences for how police kind of do their jobs. Because if the community doesn't trust them, then they need that community to have their backs to provide information and provide help. And the second quote, the police now, some are very racist. You don't know who to trust. I think my kids are fine, but we're illegal. It affects us because of many of us lose out. We are on the straight path, but others are running around, and because of them, they stop all of us. And so again here, the people in the communities that we spoke to really kind of make a distinction between enforcement of real laws, targeting real crimes, and police targeting these issues of having authorized documentation, having papers. And they see a real divide here. And this is by citizens and non-citizens in these kind of rural communities. So this idea of fear that Shirley referred to earlier is very real in their lives. And the fear is not only for those who are unauthorized, but also for authorized citizens. And this third quote, like, if someone causes a problem, I feel trust because we too have the temporary protection that government gives us. But we stay quiet. It's better if it is someone else. So people who have legal documentation, people who are citizens, are also saying that this has an impact on their lives because they're being targeted as well. They'd rather not get involved, which means that when there is a problem in the community, that they will not be responsive to the police. And that's a real problem. In addition to this, there's a problem of diffusion. Not only is it that we're worried about unauthorized immigrants, but the perception starts to increase beyond the police that the entire immigrant community in general is criminogenic or problematic. And we see that in these two quotes looking at people talking about schools and the immigrant children, that they're all being seen as gang members, as criminals, as offenders, that this rhetoric that's tied to immigrants, authorized or unauthorized, starts to expand throughout the community, where they are now all seen as criminal, regardless of their behavior. And again, that has consequences. You know, Shirley talked about social disorganization. This mistrust of the police, mistrust in each other, mistrust and lack of communication can raise levels of crime in communities. And finally, in these communities, they talked about feeling marginalized, that they're no longer a part of it, that initially they were welcome in the community, but now, given the recent legal changes, the recent rhetoric, even though nothing else has changed in the community, their behavior hasn't changed, that they're no longer welcome. And so this is the dynamic that we're trying to understand. And remember, this is kind of small rural communities where people can't hide, people can't get lost in the mix like you can in New York City. And I have a couple of other slides here that refer to some of the issues that were raised by Juan in terms of what's going on at the federal level. But I think, let me just show the tension here that we're going to continue to see is that although at the federal level, at the national level, the movement is towards deferred action. The movement is towards let's stop enforcement, let's stop deportations. The reality is at the local level, there's real concern about how this is actually occurring. And although the language says let's defer action, let's provide a pathway, let's provide an avenue, what we're seeing in terms of deportations is increases, increases, and increases, with more than a fourfold increase over the last 10 years. And you know, record levels that we haven't seen historically. But I'll stop right here. Thank you.
Okay, great. So how are we doing for time? Is there? Oh, so we have. Okay, so we've got plenty of time. So I guess what we'll do is then before we open it up, I'll ask a question to each of the presenters, and then we'll open it up to discussion, broader discussion, if that's okay. So I guess to start with Shirley, and clearly that she's getting at some terribly important responses at community level to threats of the larger legislative level and the political economy, and the increasing incursion of the state into so many different crevices of everyday life. And I guess one of the many questions here is that how she sees, I suppose, the fear of deportation and a kind of a deportational culture, not only affecting the adults, but affecting the children of immigrants.
So I do plan to look at that. Is this working? It's very low. Okay, I do plan to look at that eventually. Right now, I spoke about my dissertation work, which is looking at the communities, but I plan to expand that. I mean, I also want to look at the reason why some communities are targeted more than others. I have an idea of why. I look at the minority threat perspective, and I also want to look at how it affects children as well. But that's for the book.
Okay.
That's later. I mean, but for right now, for this work, I'm looking at community level fear. But eventually, I'd like to expand that to look at, members of the family, which ones exactly, and also children. I definitely want to look at that.
Right. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating because there's lots of work done on the fear amongst young people, that live in areas which are highly criminalised, where there's very large police presences, and how young people adapt to those presences of constantly being watched and suspected, and it changes their social behaviour. They can only go certain places, they can only hang out with certain people at certain times, and it changes. The whole rhythm of life changes as one adapts to kind of an ecology of fear, which is increasingly the case in the United States. And so what do you get? And I think, to preempt, what Shirley might be finding, is that in the case of vulnerable communities such as immigrants, you double up that fear quotient. So you're already, under suspicion because you're brown, right? And you're poor. And now you're under treble suspicion because you also might be one of those people that somehow get targeted by secure communities or secure community programs, when police are kind of, their sensibilities are heightened to suspect certain people of doing certain things because of the way they are and the way they look and where they live. And this kind of gets passed on, especially from adults to children. One of the other aspects of this, he's not kind of in sort of the flavour of the month anymore, but there was when I was at Berkeley, there was a guy called John Ogbu, and John was talking about, what is it amongst, South African American children, how do the adults pass on messages to their children about sort of making it in life, how you do in school, and so, and they're saying, they bring back from the workplace, where they're often discriminated against, it's, you can struggle on in school and you can do, but Christ, you can never fight the man, right? Or there's always some bloody great, obstacle you can't get over, or you're always wrong for some reason, and they don't really hand that off as the major message, but the kids pick up on it, right? And I think that's what goes on in a lot of immigrant families. It's not that, you hand on to your kids, but they pick up on the fear and the kind of constantly being, under suspicion and constantly being judged. So it comes on to Michelle, and it sort of links to that kind of where I was going a little bit with that one, is kind of, you know, I don't know what you call this, deportation while driving or something, you know, I mean, it's one of the, I mean, is there a sense that sort of, you know, the relation, I was thinking about the driving license thing is so important because it's in a country which is so wedded, you know, to travel and mobility and the car, you know, I mean, less so here in New York, but certainly if you're in the Midwest of California, that, you know, it totally messes up your life if you can't get a license and you can't get to work and you can't get that job 25 miles away and you can't get all those sorts of things, you know. And I'm just wondering, and while that's, you know, a strange form of sovereignty about, you know, citizenship and social citizenship, is there any way you can relate this kind of denial of, you know, of a driving license and being an authorized person with racial profiling?
All right, can you hear me? Yeah. All right. So when I first got to DC, it was right before 9/11, like a week before 9/11. And so, you know, at that time, the conversation was really about expanding access to driver's licenses for all people regardless of immigration status, that most states did not have legal presence requirements in their laws. But there were kind of these de facto legal presence requirements because they would say you have to have a social security number or you have to have other documents that that basically meant that unauthorized immigrants couldn't get licenses. But again, it wasn't written right in the law. And you know, in the advocacy community, there was this huge push, and there were coalitions forming in many, many states to get rid of those social security number requirements, for example, and to make sure that in all the states that unauthorized immigrants had access to licenses. So then after 9/11, remember, driver's licenses was completely linked to terrorism because the 9/11 terrorists had driver's licenses. And most of them had perfectly good, valid driver's licenses because they were all here lawfully in the United States. It had nothing to do with unauthorized immigrants getting licenses, but that's how it was immediately connected. So it was just since 2001 that all of the states changed their driver's license laws to explicitly include legal presence requirements. And I think, you know, now if you're just becoming, you know, aware of these issues and, you know, if that's been your reality for most of your life, that there were all these restrictions and now you see a couple of states changing them to allow access, I don't know, I just kind of have a different perspective on it. It's like, this is the way it used to be, and the last 10 years have been this aberration. So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is, because it was all caught up in 9/11, because it was caught up in this anti-terrorism rhetoric, the denial of driver's licenses, I believe, was very much related to racial profiling and other types of activities that took place as a result of the terrorist activities.
Great. Okay, good. And let's go on to Juan very briefly. I mean, the one, I guess, you know, is sort of a simple question, but it's sort of it's something that never gets really answered very well by sort of mainstream media or even sort of mainstream criminology. You know, over the years, especially since 9/11, but you know, even before 9/11, you know, we've been society has been you know, the governments have launched one kind of program after the other to supposedly keep us all safe, right? I mean, you know, the Patriot Act and some other act, and you know, it's like we can't be safe enough here, despite, you know, not too many terrorist attacks, you know, happening on American soil after 9/11. And despite, you know, so many, in terms of immigration, you know, so many statistics that point to an inverse relationship between immigration and crime. I mean, actually, the relationship is the opposite. And in fact, you know, over time in American society, the the constituents, that part of the population actually with the lowest crime rates are immigrant communities, especially amongst their first generation immigration. So the question I'm always perplexed by is how secure has the policy of secure communities made our communities?
I think there's a lot of ongoing work, and every month I see a new study talking about the erosion of trust at the community level, the dissolution of community policing strategies as a way to serve immigrant communities, and it's not. So the consequences of secure communities would be the kind of research that we would need to keep following and seeing if that's a continuing issue. The two forces that I'll underline from my presentation that I think really matter for determining whether or not we have secure communities in the real sense are, and I'll just focus on them very quickly here. One is a formal policy. One has been a series of informal decisions that have been made at different levels of society. The first one is the war on drugs, and I mentioned it earlier. Not only are some counties better able at arresting people for drug crimes, it isn't the case that those arrests happen evenly in those counties, right? So we know that, and we know that that's a good predictor of deportation rates. The other thing that's made that effect even worse is segregation from all different sorts of people deciding where to live, formal decisions to keep people out of certain neighborhoods, especially in new destinations, highly visible new immigrant communities with a police force that is very interested in investigating drug crimes. Where do we think they're going to go to do their policing and put people under arrest? It shouldn't be a surprise that these other non-immigration forces are propelling the deportation threat.
Okay. And finally, onto Jorge. What's interesting, and because he's focusing on areas that we don't normally study. Most sociology and criminology is about New York City, is about Chicago, is about Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. And the areas that he's looking at now, which are huge growth areas, and he's absolutely true, especially for immigration, Latino immigration. There didn't used to be too many Latinos in Georgia. There didn't used to be too many Latinos in South Carolina, and so on and so forth. But there are now, and there didn't used to be too many Latinos even in Long Island, but. But the thing about it is in terms of the policing and how in my country, in Britain, when we face all kinds of race and ethnic issues over the last 15 to 20 years, there was a big push certainly over a decade ago for all police forces to go through sensitivity training. Cultural sensitivity training. So have them be aware of immigrant communities, and we're not all the same, and so on and so forth, right? But want to really kind of to really improve policing and make them the professionals. What is it? What do they call it? Something to serve, protect and serve, right? Whatever it is you call them here. New York's finest and all that. Okay. So I'm just wondering about in these rural communities with all these rural police forces. I mean, did I actually go through those kinds of training that would actually make them better police officers, and presumably make their relationships with the community that much more positive?
Well, hello. Well, that's kind of a tricky question, I think. Can you hear me? That's kind of a tricky question. I think there's definitely been a movement towards the professionalization of police in general across the country. But we've got a very fragmented system here, so it's kind of hit or miss in terms of where it's occurring, how much it's occurring. There's been a big movement towards requiring higher education for police officers, which arguably should lead towards greater diversity and greater perspectives on diversity, and more emphasis on that sort of training. However, I think in reality, for many locations at the ground level, they say we've got laws on the books, they enforce them as they see fit, and it is what it is. And I think that's what we really see in effect.
Great. Okay, so let's open up to you lot. What are your questions? Yeah.
I think to play on that aspect, I think one of the main things that I was always taught was don't look to New York as the model for the country. Because, you know, New York has this watchman style, New York has this watchman style mentality in their policing, where when you go into these rural areas now where, you know, these immigrants are moving to, they don't have that style. And, you know, that's where you get these, you know, where a minor driving violation will stop, where you get stopped. And I think that's very interesting on how, you know, they're focusing, how we should focus on how these police officers in these rural areas are handling, you know, these minor violations that aren't typically enforced here in New York City and in other big cities like in Los Angeles.
Someone else want to comment, say something? Someone at the back? Oh, back, yeah. Dolores.
Oh, wow, Dan is going to go to.
Yeah, go.
There's an interesting way, your work is fantastic, and there's an interesting way in which the term Latino has become sort of synonymous with immigrant. So I'm not sure if the volume addresses this, but is the Latino immigrant situation similar to or dissimilar to the situation for immigrants from other countries, and particularly white immigrants and immigrants from, say, the African continent?
Anyone want to chime in? You mean
One of the
vis-a-vis
ways-
deportation, Dolores? Or- Yeah.
One of the reasons why I chose Astoria versus Jackson Heights, and I wasn't able to show these statistics too much because I ran out of time, but it's because they are both highly immigrant, but the demographic of the immigrant is quite different. So you have about 45% European immigrants and 27% Hispanic immigrants in Astoria versus 64% Hispanic and 11% European. And so I'm looking specifically at that, at what the experience is, if there's the same level of fear. What I found so far, and you know, my population is still very small, I haven't conducted many interviews yet, but from the ones that I do have, there is confidence, right? There's fear of deportation. No one wants to get deported, right? But in Astoria, the people I spoke with, they say, I'm okay because I'm not doing anything wrong. And so I'm all right. I don't have to fear it. If I don't do anything wrong, I'm not going to get deported. Whereas in Jackson Heights, the number of people I've spoken to, none of them have committed crimes either, right? I removed 2 people from that set in this discussion. In both Astoria and in Jackson Heights, there were 1 person in each set that smoked marijuana. So if they got arrested, that would be a crime, right? So I took them out, and in this, none of them have committed crime. There is still fear in Jackson Heights. They don't commit crimes, but they still feel that walking down the street, they might get stopped. And if they do get stopped, and they're put through the CAP system of secure communities, you know, their fingerprints are sent out, then they might get detained and they'll get deported. So the experience, I mean, I don't have too many people that I've been speaking with, but so far there is still, there is a different experience there. And I just want to say really quick, this was another slide. When we look at the fiscal persons removed in 2010 alone, the top 14 countries of the people who have been deported, the top 14 countries come from brown nations.
I think it's clear listening to work so far, even just this afternoon, that if we want to make a difference and dampen the deportation threat across different race and skin color groups, you want to desegregate and give social groups as few opportunities to say that's the neighborhood where the criminals are. That's the neighborhood where those types of immigrants live. That's 1. 2, tone really matters. If you start talking about deportation acceleration, if you start talking about, well, you know they're all criminals anyway, tone matters from elected officials, from other public officials, and that makes a huge difference, and I think that's undeniable across all sorts of different social science research. And the last thing that I'll mention is, this should be really obvious, if we want to address disparities in who we target, and if we want to dampen deportation rates of people who committed very low-level crimes, we need to focus on jobs and the economy. When the economy tanks, even at the local level, that's a really good predictor of deportation and singling people out, especially in segregated neighborhoods.
Blimey, a lot of questions. Yeah.
You sort of answered my question because I wanted to deal with Caribbean deportation. And what I was asked year 2009 to do a paper on. My topic was the human consequences of deportation, its impact on families and the communities. I was one of the non-lawyer speakers, but what I did, I was a paralegal interning with an attorney who went to deportation courts like 3-4 times a week. So what I could present was the actual when we did relief, so it was whatever we interviewed. And what I found was that the first thing I did on the conference was to tell them about lawful permanent residents who were deported. Nobody knew about that statistics. Did you guys bring that into your research? And what about people who turned up for interviews? The papers were wrong. We know removal of conditions, things like that. So we had to show them that there was a different side of deportation, not just criminals. You could be deported for these reasons.
Yeah,
so I wondered if you brought this into your research as well.
I'd love to be able to do that kind of work. The data I have is at the county level, so I don't have individual case level data. I will say one study coming out of MIT recently that is very much in line with work on asylum cases that came out in 2008 that did find that asylum decisions are driven by who the judge is and where, not the facts of your case, but who you're sitting in front of to make your case. And that should disturb us.
And just one thing before I finish.
The other one that's coming out is a research on green cards. So people who are applying for legal permanent residency in the country, they are finding a strong effect after accounting for everything else of being from Latin America and being Arab. If there is not enough funding to look at the facts of the entire file. So when people who are in charge of making legal permanent resident decisions for workers down in Atlanta, if they're only given a small amount of time to look at a file, guess what? They default to nationality stereotypes, and they deny some people more than others. It doesn't directly speak to your question, but I think it's an important study that's coming out.
I just want to tell just something with Shirley that what I found too was that the flip side of fear is stigma, and then I had to deal with stigmatization here, and then when you go home, there is such stigma that we in Jamaica are now trying to call them returnees. We're not calling them deportees. And the Jamaican people have actually made a verb out of deportation, them dip you. So, it's a very interesting.
I will say that in my chapter, I don't make it, when I say I'm going to interview folks, I don't make a distinction on their status. Because if you're an immigrant, you're deportable whether you have, I call them the deportable population, right? Because whether you have papers or not, if you're not a citizen, you can be deported, right? So the fear is there on all levels.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to our school. I just wanted to say, as an Afro-Latino, I feel like she said, there is a number of people that don't have knowledge of the fact that there's not just Latinos. I'm Latino myself, but I also see my Asian colleagues, and I see the African refugees. Out of the 11 million people, everybody thinks that all of us are illegal because we came here through the border. I was brought here when I was young because my visa expired. Migration is not because people want to. In places like Colombia or like in South America, migrations of Afro descendants is very brutal because the United States is pushing this new military bases, this new, so like, I don't know how, is there any way that we can New York, like the guy said before, New York, like the guy said before, is the city that stands for liberty, but California is now allowing people to drive and be able to, whoever graduated from school, have a law degree, even if you're undocumented. Any ideas on, what can we do as, city students to be able to pursue that in the state level? Because the federal level is too packed to be able to push immigration when we have a shutdown, I think, So any ideas?
Anybody?
I'm just not clear. Any ideas of what? I'm sorry.
How to push the state to be able to concentrate on more of, instead of just pursuing federal level, just pursuing the little things like, if you want to drive, be able to get that. If you want to, educate yourself. Many students, they have to apply as international students, even though they graduated from the, New York City school department. So they got to pay twice as much because of the fact that they're immigrant students. And by giving more visas, people are still going to be able to, people are still going to be undocumented because it takes 4 years for their applications to be renewed and stuff like that. So even if we concentrate on just saying people are coming illegal, that's not the problem. We are admitting people and we're not, building a gateway. We are educating people so they could go to the countries and we're not taking a product out of that. So I just feel like that's something that we could take advantage of in the state level, I think.
So my understanding of the question, and you can tell me if I'm right here, is the question is really about advocacy and some advice for advocating on the state level where, the federal level seems to be pretty much frozen at this point. I know that only a few of you on stage are from New York State, but if you can speak to New York State or if you can speak more generally to state level advocacy, that might be helpful.
I'm not that aware of activities here in New York State, but I do know that there are some very, very strong advocacy groups, and I'm sure some of you in this room work with those advocacy groups that have been pushing very hard in Albany on the driver's license issue. For years, this has been an issue, and it became very politicized, I believe, so maybe somebody else has more of the history there. And there's a New York DREAM Act that came very close to passage, right? Mm-hmm. So I know that there is some very strong advocacy, and you just need to go back to Albany this year and keep pushing. And now maybe because these other states have passed the laws, it will make it a little bit easier for a second wave of states to pass laws this coming session.
And even this initiative, right, that we're having in the school, which is almost unprecedented, right, semester-wide, something almost every, is also going to enlighten you on what's out there and how you can get involved. And I think one of the events we're going to be introducing several activists that are involved in immigration and deportation initiatives, right? So I think, take one of the flyers as well and come to as many as you can, because you're going to be meeting a lot of people who are heavily involved in activism.
And just let me add to that a little bit, because I'm looking at state level initiatives, and I think if you look at where restrictionist legislation is going into place, right, it's really about people's beliefs about immigrant populations being dangerous, problematic, criminal, taken away from the economy, and it's about changing that language, changing those beliefs, and making sure that if you look at places where there is more pro-immigrant policies going into place, that you've got a critical mass of people who are fighting the rhetoric and who are civically involved, and you see a more grassroots movement, and that they're voting, and they're voting, and that's driving the state legislatures and the local politicians, and that's the only way I think that policy is actually going to change, because it's not tied to any real statistics about what's going on at the local level.
I mean, one thing might happen is, we may actually get a progressive mayor soon in New York City who's committed to doing, advocating for the poor and particularly for vulnerable immigrant communities. So things might change, and the days of the billionaire might be over. You never know.
I feel like minority immigrants, they are considered a liability, whereas European are not. Also, I'm looking at the deportation is another way to control the population, the increase of minorities, with maybe the hopes of keeping the segregation, racism at the level that it is. I believe that there is an underlying agenda, whereas when you say the word immigrant, you automatically go to minority. Most people, if you say immigrant, they never think European. They never think countries or, the white race. So I feel like, your take on it as well. Do you feel like deportation is another way to control the minority population from growing, in addition to keeping minorities segregated to keep racism within the country without actually saying it, it's like subliminal.
I think the way that it gets talked about isn't in terms of white versus non-white immigrants usually, although there's a subtext there. Usually it's talked about high-skilled immigrants versus family reunification immigrants. And if you paid attention to what's going on with the Senate and their draft bills, there was a lot of tug of war over, do we emphasize immigrants who are highly educated at the expense of reuniting families that are already here, and what countries would they be coming from? So I think that some of this isn't explicitly racialized, even though there's a subtext there, and even if it isn't intentional, some of the consequences, there might be a disparate impact, for example. If we're not careful about which types of countries or which types of backgrounds we're including or excluding, the policies we put in place might end up giving really high preference to some groups versus others, whether or not anyone means to. You can take out the motivation of wanting to be implementing racialized preferences, but if you're not mindful of the difference between different nationalities, different legal statuses, different skill levels, and family reunification, you might end up putting things into place that look, on their face, very racialized. But that's something that is in limbo right now with the House not taking any action on these things.
Yep.
I have a comment and a question. I just had a very lengthy discussion with a police officer about my opinion that stop and frisk is unconstitutional, and we all know that it's more often applied to minorities and to immigrants. So it was a lengthy discussion. He's about to retire. He's been with the NYPD Intel, and he was telling me that the problem wasn't really so much the policy itself, but that how it's applied. And he said that there was insufficient training of the NYPD, and that it's always been a problem, but it's getting worse. And although we would hope that things like formal education at John Jay would really address those things, his opinion, which I thought was valuable to listen to, was it really needs to be specific educational intensive training in relationship to the job that would address things like stereotypes and how you apply these things. And I thought it was a very important point, especially given that we keep taking money away from the police department. And I know many police officers that have talked to me in confidence about the fact that they don't like the militarization of the police, they don't agree with stop and frisk, they don't feel the freedom to speak up in NYPD because politics are running the show. That's partly because of ignorance. So I think we should train them. They want the training. We have to find a way to get them the money, and that would set a precedent that gives a larger statement to all of New York. The other thing is a question and a comment. I had a good friend from St. Lucia, and she kept having to file over and over again to get her citizenship. And the private agency kept losing her stuff and charging her over and over again. And then she'd get threatened with, you know, we're going to put your son in jail. And his son was born here. Finally, on principle, after they'd lost her paperwork for the fourth time, she said, I have $5,000. I'm hiring a private immigration lawyer. On principle, I'm not dealing with you guys again. She won. But what I don't understand is, why is that a privatized thing? Wouldn't you think immigration offices wouldn't be for profit? They'd be part of government, state or federal? I don't understand that.
This certainly is an issue around the country, that whenever there's a program like DACA or a legalization program or even rumors of a legalization program, there are people trying to make a buck off of it, right, and take advantage of people who are very vulnerable and then charge them for services that they cannot perform, or charge them, you know, making all kinds of promises for them that they can't fulfill. So that is another trend in state legislation and at the local level as well, is our consumer protection laws, and basically regulating who can advertise as an immigration expert. And in California, along with the driver's license law and the Trust Act, one of the laws that was just passed was also consumer protection. So protecting DACA applicants from people who are trying to fraudulently take their money, and also in anticipation of comprehensive immigration reform, again, protecting immigrants from scam artists, basically.
Really quick, in Jackson Heights, I did a walkthrough, I did a tour, and there are a lot of immigrant targeting businesses, notaries, immigration services, and sometimes they promise you things that they can't get, right? They can't guarantee you're gonna get citizenship, right? But you have all of these. We walked 4 blocks, and in 4 blocks, I counted 22 immigrant targeting businesses. It was crazy. Right, and this is just 4 blocks on each side. And I remember I was talking at the same time, so I probably missed a couple. You know, that's not answering your question, but it's definitely a statement that supports what you're expressing some, you know, aggravation about.
Can I just kind of clarify here? It certainly is my understanding that all immigration-related business is the business of federal agencies, that there are no private agencies who could process a stay of deportation or a green card application or any of these other, you know, those are not things that should ever be done by private agencies. And if they are, then that's a private agency that was defrauding your friend. Is that a correct answer to this question?
Right. I think generally these agencies promise to help you fill out your paperwork and give them to USCIS to process, and then promising a certain outcome when they may not have any qualifications to do that at all.
It's an important clarification, just so you're aware that, you know, you would never submit that paperwork to a private agency. They may be advertising services as an agency that would help you with the process, but they are federal agencies that you would deal with.
I agree, like you said, federal government has control of immigration, but when these people get arrested, they end up in private prisons. Sure. So how can we say the federal government is the one that is engaging in it, but they're getting thrown out into a private prison that is owned by somebody in Wall Street, and they're making money out of it? Because a lot of immigrants don't get the right to be able to have a lawyer, or, you know, just because of the fact that you don't speak English, you might not know what your law is. So it's like that's a cynicism that I'm like is very hypocritical, because to make money out of it, it is private. And to the lady, when you say minority, we should stop using minority, because black people voted more than white people last year for Obama. 50,000 students that graduate are Latinos or are immigrants. So we are not a minority until we stop using that word. You understand? Mm-hmm. We are not. Asian Americans, they use them as skilled workers. We need those skilled workers. It's until we stop using that word, because we are not. I mean, if you put it numerically, we're not. This is mentally we are. Some people, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just for the record, under deportation laws, a deportable alien has no right, to representation. You claim the right. That's why so many people in detention, don't fight deportation. I mean, they just, or they sign away their right to appeal once they're in prison. The percentage that come to the appeals court, so the immigration appeals court, is very tiny, probably 6 or 7% of the total people who are deported. When they're represented, either they're represented, they pay for it, or, in New York City, fortunately, we have a thing called the Legal Aid Society, whose funds have also been cut, but there is a whole, immigration sector that I do a lot of work with them, and they get money from the city and from various quarters, and they provide, extraordinarily valuable service for free, but they're, one of the few services to do that, or else you'll get big law firms that do pro bono work. Each of the lawyers in their first 2 or 3 years, they have to do X amount of pro bono hours, but they only take on a handful of clients. So what you get is this, vast percentage population, since we're deporting over 400,000 a year, who are getting no representation, no advice and are simply being shipped to one country or the other, mostly to Latin America, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, and it's clearly color-coded. I mean, it's absolutely, there's no doubt about it. And just one other point, the student, or whoever, was talking about in terms of the making money out of the detention centres, right? Yes, it is. The vast majority of detention centres are privately run. There's a book by a colleague, Michael Welsh, out in Rutgers, who estimated, looks at, how they look at subjects in detention in terms of their profit-making propensity, right? And he worked out that if you're a deportable alien, they make more money out of you per head, because they charge per head a certain amount, than if you were, a regular citizen in prison. So it's, so as your unit of exchange, right? That's the other thing. You're not a human being. We know that. But in particular, you're not a slave, really. I mean, you're material product that the deportation industry, which is tied to the security industry, estimates that they're going to get on you versus some other person in detention. So it's such an insidious system and promotes insidiousness all the way throughout society. Yeah.
One more quick thing on privatization. There was a turning point probably in the 90s, maybe before, right around the time of the 96 reforms, where we could have diverted a lot more funding to reimbursing local governments who were housing foreign nationals in their jails, instead of funding ICE, then INS, to perform its work. If that had happened, that might have actually deflated a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the motivation that we heard from sheriffs and other elected officials about the idea of an immigrant threat. And that was a missed opportunity, and that's why the private businesses are in the business now of putting forward contracts to local governments and county jails saying, we can house low offense, quick turnover inmates for you efficiently. And that's, I think, where that came from.
Okay, I have a couple more questions.
Yeah, so I had a question. So you earlier said that it was color-coded, and I live near a very high immigrant community in Brooklyn that happens to be all white, and nobody ever sees ICE anywhere around there. Has anybody been able to get any data on racial breakdowns or anything about ICE actions?
Oh, yeah, no, there is. I mean, it's a little bit dated, but my colleague down at NYU, Pedro Noguera, wrote an article on the racialization of deportation a few years ago. I think it's a bit old, it's about 2005, and there's probably some more recent one. And there's also another one just came out, it's actually interesting, it's on the gender and deportation, which is, another actually something which is completely, lacks scrutiny, since about 8 or 9% of deportees are women, and are completely overlooked of things out there. And ICE, doesn't break down colour, but it breaks down countries, and then you just have to, go from there.
Evan, I mentioned it before, but you weren't here, but when we look at the people removed, it says aliens removed, this is their language, but in 2010 alone, the top 10 countries from which people were deported were all black and brown countries, right? So we have Mexico 1, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Nicaragua, and Jamaica. Those are the top 10. And then they have all other countries, right? But the top 10, the bulk of those people being deported are from black and brown areas.
One really interesting place to look for it, and this might even be historical data from when INS was INS, go to a place like Chicago, where Mexican and Polish immigrants working alongside each other on the south side of different sorts of legal backgrounds, and then just go back and do a FOIA and figure out what was happening there. Was there a disparity based on Polish versus Mexican immigrants, Central American immigrants? That would be a really interesting, pretty straightforward thing to do that might help answer this question. So at the workplace too, not just residential.
Because I never see I mean, it's pretty striking that there are no Russian deportations, given the amount of Russians there are in Brooklyn.
Is that? Okay, one more, sorry.
Klein told us about what happened on the buses. I think ICE has gotten smart now, because black people, they don't know who is black American, or should say from people of color from the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
So what the lady told us happened on her bus was that they engaged you in conversation.
Oh.
So they took off the Latinos and the Asian people first. That's what she told me happened on the bus. And then they went around and asked you things like, what is your favorite TV? How is the weather, to find out your accent. And she found that they were taking off white people, with accents, and black people with accents. So that may be a new trend.
Somebody, is that anything else? Okay, catch you later, thanks.